You got fat." He said it loud enough for the entire room to hear, like it was a joke everyone was supposed to laugh at. And the worst part was, they did. I didn't. I just stood there, holding my breath like if I stayed still enough, maybe I could disappear between the clinking glasses and low music of the restaurant. Maybe I could shrink back into the version of myself that didn't feel like every eye was measuring me, judging me, reducing me to a number on a scale I hadn't stepped on in months. My fingers tightened around the strap of my purse, knuckles turning white, while his smirk grew wider, more confident, feeding off the attention. "What happened to you, Liv?" he added, shaking his head like he was disappointed, like I was something that had gone wrong. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but I didn't give him what he wanted. No tears, no reaction, just silence. Because reacting would mean explaining, and explaining would mean telling a truth I wasn't ready to share with anyone. Not here. Not like this. My hand moved instinctively, brushing lightly over my stomach, subtle enough that no one noticed, but enough to ground me. A quiet reminder. A secret that changed everything. 8 weeks. That's what the doctor had said 2 days ago, her voice calm, clinical, like she wasn't handing me a future I hadn't planned for. 8 weeks, and already my entire life had tilted off its axis. I could still hear the soft hum of the ultrasound machine, still see the faint flicker on the screen that didn't look like much, but felt like everything. I hadn't cried then either. Just nodded, thanked her, walked out into the bright afternoon sun like the world hadn't just rewritten itself. "You should really hit the gym again," he continued, oblivious, leaning back in his chair like he owned the moment, like he owned me. Owned the past version of me he thought still existed. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself, and finally met his eyes. "I'm fine," I said quietly, my voice even, controlled, surprising even me. Because I was fine. Not because of him. Not because of anything he thought mattered. But because of what I was carrying. Because of who. He laughed, dismissive, already bored now that I wasn't playing along with his script. Around us, conversations resumed, the room moving on as quickly as it had turned to watch, like my humiliation had been nothing more than background entertainment. That's when I felt it. Not a sound. Not a touch. Just a shift. Subtle, but undeniable. The kind of shift you don't see, only feel. Like the air had changed weight. Like something had entered the room that didn't belong to the ordinary rhythm of this place. My gaze drifted past him, toward the glass doors at the front of the restaurant, and for a second, I thought I was imagining it. A black SUV parked at the curb. Engine running. Headlights cutting clean lines across the pavement. No music from inside could reach that far, but somehow, everything felt quieter just looking at it. My heart skipped, not from fear exactly, but from recognition I couldn't explain. Because even before I saw him, I knew. I didn't understand how, but I knew. The door opened. Not dramatically, not rushed, just deliberately. And he stepped out like the night itself had decided to take human form. Tailored suit, dark as the sky outside, posture straight, movements controlled in a way that made everything else feel chaotic by comparison. Conversations near the entrance faltered, voices dropping without anyone being told to lower them. People moved, not out of panic, but out of instinct, like they understood without words that space needed to be made. He didn't look around. Not at first. He didn't need to. His presence did the work for him. And then, slowly, his gaze lifted. It didn't scan the room. It found me. Direct. Unmistakable. Like he had been walking toward that exact moment all along. My breath caught, my hand pressing a little firmer against my stomach as something deep inside me tightened, not in fear, but in certainty. Because the last time I had seen those eyes, it had been raining. And everything after that had changed. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes dropped, just for a second, to where my hand rested. Then back to my face. Calculating. Certain. Like he was putting pieces together that no one else even knew existed. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I realized something that made the words from my ex fade into nothing. He already knew. He did not rush toward me, and somehow that made it worse, because every step he took felt intentional, measured, like time itself had decided to slow down just to watch him cross the room. And I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the music, louder than the quiet murmur of people pretending not to stare while staring anyway. And I knew without looking that everyone could feel it too. That invisible shift that happens when someone with real power walks into a space that was never built for him. And my ex was still talking, still, laughing at his own words, completely unaware that the air behind him had changed, that something far more important than his voice had entered the room, and I almost said his name, almost whispered it just to break the tension building in my chest, but I did not, because I was not even sure I had the right to say it. Not after that night. Not after disappearing without a word. Not after convincing myself that whatever had happened between us had been a mistake I could quietly file away and forget, except my body had not forgotten, and neither had he, because when he stopped a few feet away, there was no confusion in his eyes, no hesitation, just certainty, sharp and cold and absolute, like he had already run through every possible explanation and landed on the only one that mattered. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching thin between us until it felt like it might snap. And then he finally broke it, his voice low, controlled, but carrying in a way that made it impossible to ignore. How far along? And the words hit me harder than anything my ex had said, because they were not a question, not really. They were confirmation, and I felt my throat tighten as every excuse I had rehearsed in my head over the past 2 days evaporated, leaving me with nothing but the truth I had been trying to protect, and I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay steady even as my fingers curled slightly against my stomach. 8 weeks, I said, barely above a whisper, but he heard it. Of course he did, his gaze flicking down again, brief but deliberate, as if those 2 words had just locked something into place. And beside me my ex finally noticed, his laughter cutting off mid-breath. As he turned, irritation already forming on his face before confusion replaced it. "Who are you supposed to be?" he asked, tone sharp, defensive in the way people get when they realize they are no longer the most important person in the room. And I felt a strange calm settle over me, like I had stepped out of one reality and into another where his opinion no longer held weight, where his voice sounded smaller, less relevant. And Sebastian did not even look at him at first, did not acknowledge him, which somehow said more than any response could have, because ignoring someone like that is its own kind of answer. And when he finally did shift his gaze, it was brief, assessing, like he was categorizing a problem that had already been solved. And then he looked back at me, completely, fully, as if nothing else existed. "You should not be standing this long," he said quietly, and there was something different in his tone now. Something that was not there before, not just control, not just authority, but something steadier, grounded, and it caught me off guard because I had expected anger, questions, maybe even distance, but not this, not concern delivered so simply it felt undeniable, and I shook my head slightly, instinctively pushing back. "I am fine," I said again, but it sounded weaker this time, less convincing, even to myself, and his eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in frustration, but in recognition, like he had already learned that about me, that I would say I was fine even when I was not. And for a moment I was back there again, rain against glass, the world outside blurred and distant, his hand steady on the steering wheel, while everything else felt uncertain, and I had told myself that night meant nothing, that it was just a collision of bad timing and worse decisions. But standing here now, with his presence cutting through everything I thought I understood, I realized how wrong I had been, because nothing about this felt accidental, not anymore. And my ex tried again, louder this time, stepping forward like he needed to reinsert himself into a conversation that had already moved past him. "Hey, I am talking to you," he said, and I felt it then, that shift again, sharper this time, the temperature of the moment dropping without anything visible changing, and Sebastian's expression did not harden, did not raise, did not react in any obvious way, but something about him became still, completely still, in a way that made movement around us feel out of place. And when he spoke, it was calm, almost quiet, but it carried the kind of finality that does not need to be repeated. "You are done speaking to her." And it was not loud, it was not aggressive, but it was absolute. And for the first time since I had known him, my ex did not have a response, not a joke, not an insult, not anything at all, just silence. And I realized then that the balance had already shifted, that whatever control he thought he had over me had disappeared the moment Sebastian walked through that door, and I was no longer the girl standing alone in a crowded room, trying to shrink under someone else's words. I was something else now, something he could not define, could not touch, could not reduce. And as Sebastian's gaze returned to me, steady and unwavering. I felt it settle into place, that quiet, undeniable truth I had been trying to ignore since the doctor's office, that my life was no longer mine alone, and neither was this moment. It should have ended there, with that single sentence drawing a line no one dared to cross. But life does not shift all at once. It moves in quiet increments, in moments that feel small until you realize they changed everything. And I stood there caught between two versions of myself, the one who used to apologize for taking up space, and the one who now had no idea how to stand in a world that suddenly felt different, heavier, more defined. And my ex let out a short, disbelieving laugh like he was trying to recover something he had already lost. "You are serious right now?" he said, glancing between us like this was some kind of performance he did not understand. But there was no audience left for him, no energy feeding his voice anymore, just a room that had shifted its attention somewhere else. And for the first time since I had known him, he sounded unsure, like the ground beneath him was not as solid as he thought. And I felt it too, that subtle rebalancing, like the center of gravity had moved, and I was no longer orbiting around his approval. And Sebastian did not respond to him again, did not acknowledge the question or the tone or the challenge hidden inside it, because he did not need to. His focus stayed on me, steady and unwavering. And it was almost unsettling how completely he saw me in that moment. Not the version I had been 5 minutes ago, not the girl being laughed at, but something else entirely, something that felt protected without being asked, and I realized I had been holding my breath again. So I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself in something real, something I could control. "I did not plan to tell you," I said quietly, the words coming out before I could stop them, not to him, not really, but into the space between us that already felt charged with everything unspoken. And his expression did not change much, just a slight shift in his eyes, like he had expected that, like he understood more than I was saying, and he nodded once, a small, deliberate movement that somehow felt like permission, like acknowledgement, like he was accepting the part of the story I was offering without demanding the rest. And that alone made something in my chest loosen, because I had been bracing myself for questions, for control, for something overwhelming. But instead there was this quiet steadiness that felt almost more powerful, and my ex scoffed, louder this time, trying again to pull attention back to himself. "You are just going to stand there and ignore me?" he said, but even he could hear how it sounded now. Thinner, less certain, and I turned to him finally, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because I wanted to, because I needed to close that chapter in a way I never had before, and I looked at him properly, really looked, and for the first time I did not feel small, did not feel like I needed to defend myself or explain anything. "I think you already said everything you wanted to say," I told him, my voice calm. Not sharp, not emotional, just clear, and that seemed to hit harder than anything else, because there was nothing left for him to push against, no reaction to twist, no weakness to exploit, just a boundary he could not move. And he opened his mouth like he was going to argue, like he was going to say something else, something louder, something that might restore whatever he thought he had lost. But then he stopped, his eyes flicking past me again, landing on Sebastian, and whatever he saw there was enough to make him hesitate, enough to make him step back instead of forward. And that was when I understood something I had never fully grasped before. That power does not always announce itself. It does not always need volume or force. Sometimes it just exists so completely that everything else adjusts around it. And as my ex muttered something under his breath and turned away, retreating into the background he used to pull me into, I felt a strange sense of quiet settle over me. Not victory, not relief exactly, but clarity, like a door had closed without noise. And when I turned back, Sebastian was still there, exactly where he had been, like he had never considered leaving, and his gaze softened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. "You should come with me," he said, and there was no command in it, no pressure, just certainty, like he was offering something that already belonged to this new version of my life. And I hesitated for half a second, not because I doubted him, but because I understood what stepping toward him meant, that it was not just leaving a room or a conversation. It was crossing into something I could not undo, and my hand rested again against my stomach, a quiet instinct, a reminder of why everything had changed in the first place. And I lifted my eyes to meet his, steady this time, matching the calm he had given me, and without saying anything, I took that step. The night air felt different the moment I stepped outside. Cooler, quieter, like the noise of the restaurant had been sealed behind glass and left there. And for a second, I just stood on the sidewalk, breathing it in, trying to steady the way everything inside me still felt like it was shifting, like I had just walked out of one life and into another without any warning. And Sebastian did not rush me. He did not reach for me or guide me. He simply walked beside me with that same controlled pace, as if he trusted I would keep up, as if he knew I had already chosen to follow. And the black SUV waited at the curb, engine low and steady, the kind of presence that did not draw attention because it did not need to. And one of the men near the vehicle opened the door the moment we approached, not looking at me, not speaking, just stepping back with a precision that made everything feel rehearsed, intentional. And I hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, because getting into that car felt like crossing a line I could not uncross, like stepping into a version of the world that operated on rules I did not fully understand, and my fingers tightened slightly against my stomach, that quiet instinct grounding me once more, reminding me that this was not just about me anymore. And when I looked up, Sebastian was already watching me, not impatient, not pushing, just waiting. And something about that made the decision easier, because it did not feel like I was being taken. It felt like I was choosing, and I stepped in, the leather seat cool beneath me, the interior silent in a way that felt insulated from everything outside. And he followed a second later, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than it should have been, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I had not realized I was writing. And for a moment neither of us spoke. The city lights sliding past the tinted windows as the car pulled away from the curb, smooth and controlled, and I watched them blur together, trying to make sense of the way my life had shifted in less than 10 minutes. And it was him who broke the silence this time, his voice lower now, more contained in the quiet space. "Why did you not tell me?" And it was not accusatory, not sharp, just direct, and I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly against the seat, feeling the weight of the question settle in my chest. Because I did not know how. I admitted, my voice softer than before. But honest, because there was no point pretending now, not with him, not after everything that had already been laid bare, and he did not respond immediately. His gaze fixed ahead for a moment, before shifting to me again, studying, not judging, just taking in, like he was piecing together something that mattered. And I continued before I could lose the courage to say it. That night was not supposed to become anything, I said, choosing my words carefully, not to minimize it, but to explain the space it had lived in for me, something unexpected, something I had filed away as a moment that would not repeat. And his jaw tightened just slightly at that, the only sign that my words had landed somewhere deeper, but he nodded once, accepting it without interruption, and that steadiness again, that refusal to react in a way that made things chaotic, made it easier to keep going. And then I found out. I added, my hand resting lightly over my stomach again, more openly this time, not hiding the gesture anymore. And the movement drew his eyes, held them there for a second longer than before. And something shifted in his expression, not softer exactly, but more focused, more certain, like whatever distance had existed between that night and this moment had just closed completely. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet authority, but now there was something else layered underneath it, something that felt grounded in responsibility rather than control. "You are not handling this alone," he said, and the words settled between us, firm and unwavering, not a suggestion, not a question, just a fact. And I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant, because part of me had already prepared to do exactly that, to navigate this quietly, privately, without pulling anyone else into it, especially him. But hearing him say it like that, so certain, so absolute, made something inside me shift again, like a door I had kept closed was being opened whether I was ready or not. And I turned my head slightly to look at him fully, really look this time, not just at the presence he carried, but at the man sitting beside me, the one connected to everything changing inside my body, inside my life. And for the first time since the doctor's office, I did not feel alone in it. The car did not feel like it was moving fast, but the city outside blurred in a way that made time feel compressed, like Everything familiar was being left behind without resistance, and I kept my gaze on the window for a moment longer, watching reflections of streetlights slide across the glass, until I realized I was not trying to see the city. I was trying to avoid looking at him again, because looking at him meant acknowledging that what he said was real, that I was not alone in this anymore, and that terrified me in a way I had not expected, because being alone had been something I could control, something I understood, and I turned back slowly, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "You do not get to decide that," I said, my voice quiet but firmer than before, not defensive, just honest, because I needed to hold on to some part of myself in all of this. And his expression did not harden, did not shift into something confrontational. It stayed steady, almost patient, which somehow made it harder to push back against. "It is not a decision," he replied, just as calm, just as certain, and I felt a flicker of frustration rise in my chest. Not at him exactly, but at how easily he spoke in absolutes, like the world always aligned with what he believed, and maybe for him it did, but my world had never worked that way, and I shook my head slightly, exhaling. "I have been handling things on my own for a long time," I said, not as a challenge, but as a fact, something that had shaped me long before he walked into that restaurant. And for a moment, something in his gaze shifted, not dismissive, not disagreeing, but recognizing, like he understood that statement carried more weight than the words themselves, and he nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before leaning back slightly in his seat, giving me space without stepping away. "You will not have to anymore," he said, softer this time, not losing the certainty, but changing the way it landed, and that difference mattered more than I expected, because it no longer felt like he was taking something from me. It felt like he was offering something I had never allowed myself to consider, and the silence that followed was not tense, not uncomfortable, just full, like both of us were recalibrating to a reality neither of us had planned. And after a few seconds, I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since he stepped into the restaurant. "How did you know?" And he did not pretend to misunderstand, did not deflect. His eyes flicked briefly to my hand resting against my stomach before returning to my face. "You touched your stomach before I even reached you," he said, and I blinked, surprised by how simple the answer was, how obvious, and yet how completely I had missed it, because to me it had been instinct, unconscious, but to him it had been information, a detail he noticed and processed instantly. And something about that realization made me feel exposed in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable, just seen, more clearly than I was used to. And I let out a quiet breath, almost a small laugh, shaking my head slightly. I did not even realize I was doing it, I admitted, and his gaze softened just a fraction, enough to change the space between us again. "I did," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just fact, and I found myself studying him. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he seemed to notice everything without effort, and I remembered that night more clearly now. The rain, the silence, the way he had looked at me then, like he was already paying attention in ways I had not understood, and the car slowed slightly, turning onto a quieter street lined with buildings that looked nothing like the ones near the restaurant, taller, more private, the kind of place that did not invite attention. And I felt a subtle shift in my chest again, not fear, but awareness, because wherever we were going, it was not somewhere temporary, not somewhere casual, and I glanced at him once more, searching his expression for something that might tell me what came next, but all I found was that same steady certainty, like he had already decided the path forward and was simply waiting for me to walk it with him. And as the car came to a smooth stop in front of a building that looked more like a statement than a home, I realized something I had not been ready to admit until now, that stepping into this was not just about him, or even about the child. It was about who I was becoming in the process, and whether I was ready to stop surviving quietly and start living in a world that would never ignore me again. The building rose in front of me like it had nothing to prove, all clean lines and dark glass, the kind of place that did not advertise wealth because it did not need to. And for a moment I stayed seated even after the car stopped, my hand still resting against my stomach, my mind catching up to everything that had already happened, because stepping out felt like stepping into something permanent, something that would not let me return to the version of my life I had just left behind. And the door opened smoothly before I could decide. cool air brushing against my skin as one of the men stepped back to give me space. Not looking at me directly, not speaking, just waiting, and I glanced at Sebastian, half expecting him to say something, to explain, to give me a reason that would make this easier. But he did not. He simply met my gaze with that same steady certainty, like explanations were unnecessary between us now, like the situation spoke for itself, and that silence told me more than words could have. So I stepped out, my shoes meeting the pavement with a quiet sound that felt louder in my head than it should have been, and the city noise seemed distant here, muted by the height of the building and the way everything was designed to feel removed, controlled. And as we walked toward the entrance, I became aware of how aware I was of him beside me, not just his presence, but the way everything around us adjusted to it. The doors opening before we reached them, the lobby, already prepared, lights warm but not soft, polished surfaces reflecting movement without distraction, and I had never been in a place like this before. Not really. Not in a way that felt like I belonged there. And that thought surfaced before I could stop it, familiar and quiet. But this time it did not settle the way it used to. It did not shrink me. It just existed, acknowledged, and then left behind as we moved forward. And the elevator ride was silent, the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable but heavy with everything unspoken. And I watched the numbers climb, each floor marking distance from the life I understood. And when the doors opened again, it was onto a private space that felt less like an apartment and more like a world contained within walls, open, expansive, with windows stretching from floor to ceiling. The city laid out below like something distant, something separate, and I stopped just inside, taking it in without meaning to, the scale of it, the stillness, the way everything felt intentional, and I realized I had not said anything since we arrived, not because I had nothing to say, but because I did not know where to start, and Sebastian moved past me with the same calm precision, setting his jacket aside, not in a hurry, not trying to impress, just existing in a space that clearly belonged to him. And after a second, he turned back, his gaze finding me again, grounding me in a way that felt both unfamiliar and steady. "You can sit," he said, his voice lower here, more contained in the quiet of the room, and I nodded slightly, moving toward the nearest chair, lowering myself into it slowly, aware of my body in a way I had not been before, not just mine anymore. And I exhaled once I was seated, a small release of tension I had not realized I was carrying, and he watched me for a moment, not intrusively, just attentively, like he was taking in details that mattered, and then he spoke again. "Have you seen a doctor?" And the question was simple, practical, but it grounded everything in reality in a way that made this feel less like a moment and more like a situation that required decisions, steps, a future. And I nodded, my fingers resting lightly over my stomach again, not hiding it now. "2 days ago," I said, my voice quieter in the larger space. They confirmed it. And he held my gaze for a second longer, processing, and then gave a small nod, the kind that felt like he was marking something important, something that would guide what came next. And for a moment, neither of us spoke again. But this silence was different from the others, less uncertain, more grounded, like the first layer of something new had just settled into place. And as I looked around the room once more, then back at him, I realized that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something I could pretend was temporary. The quiet stretched just long enough for me to hear my own breathing, steady but not calm, and I realized that this was the first moment since everything had unraveled that I was actually sitting still, not reacting, not defending, not trying to shrink or escape, just existing in a space where nothing was demanding anything from me. And that alone felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, and Sebastian moved slightly, not closer, not farther, just enough to shift the energy in the room again, like he understood how to control distance as much as presence. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same grounded calm. "You will need consistent care," he said, not as a warning, not as a command, just a statement that felt anchored in something practical, something forward. And I nodded faintly, my gaze dropping for a second to my hands, to the subtle curve that only I seemed to notice, and I traced it lightly with my fingers, more conscious of it now than ever before. "I know," I replied, softer, because this part one had already started to accept the appointments, the changes, the quiet responsibility growing day by day. But what I had not prepared for was this: someone else stepping into that responsibility without hesitation, without asking permission in the way I was used to. And I looked up again, meeting his eyes. I was going to figure it out, I added, not to push him away, but to hold on to that truth, that I had not been lost, just alone, and his gaze held mine steadily. Not dismissing that, not challenging it, but not stepping back from his own position either. "You still will," he said, and there was something different in that answer, something that did not take control away from me but stood beside it, reinforcing instead of replacing, and that subtle shift mattered more than anything else he could have said, because it changed the dynamic from something imposed to something shared, and I felt that difference settle into me slowly, like a realization I was not used to having. And I exhaled quietly, leaning back slightly into the chair, letting some of the tension leave my shoulders, and the room felt less overwhelming now, less like a place I did not belong and more like a place I was learning to exist within. And after a moment, I asked the question that had been building in the background of everything else. "Why does this matter so much to you?" And the words came out carefully, not accusing, not doubting, just honest, because I needed to understand where this certainty came from, why he stepped into this without hesitation when it would have been easier not to. And for the first time since I had known him, he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly, not away, but inward, like he was considering something beyond the surface of the question. And the silence that followed was different from the others, heavier, more deliberate. And when he finally spoke, his voice was still controlled, still calm, but there was something deeper underneath it now, something that felt less like authority and more like truth. "Because it is mine," he said, and the words landed between us with a weight that was not possessive in the way I had heard before, not something that reduced or confined, but something that acknowledged connection, responsibility, something that extended beyond just him. And his eyes flicked briefly to my stomach again before returning to my face. "And because of you," he added, quieter this time, almost like it was not something he said often, and I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear, not from pressure, but from the way those words shifted something inside me that I had kept guarded for a long time. Because no one had ever framed me as something worth standing for without conditions, without expectations attached, and I searched his expression, trying to find something that would make it easier to categorize, to understand, but all I found was that same steady certainty layered now with something I had not seen before, something that felt personal. And I looked away for a second, not to escape, but to process, my hand returning to my stomach, more consciously this time, acknowledging the connection between us that could no longer be ignored. And when I looked back at him, the room felt different again, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had, even if just a little, even if just enough to realize that this was no longer a situation I could keep at a distance. It was something I was already inside of, whether I was ready or not. Something about the way he said it stayed with me. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like it had already been decided long before I asked the question. And I sat there for a moment longer than I meant to, letting the weight of it settle into places I had kept guarded, places that had learned to expect conditions, limits, exits. And this did not feel like any of those things. This felt fixed. And that scared me in a way I could not immediately explain, because fixed meant real, and real meant I could not walk away from it without consequence. And I shifted slightly in the chair, my fingers resting over my stomach again, tracing that same absent motion that had given me away earlier. But this time I did not pull my hand back when I realized I was doing it. I let it stay, acknowledging it openly, and his gaze followed the movement without hesitation, not intrusive, not possessive, just aware, like it mattered to him in a way that was no longer abstract. And I swallowed lightly, looking back up at him. "This changes everything," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. Of course he did. And he gave a small nod, not dismissing the weight of it, not trying to minimize what I was feeling, just accepting it as fact. "It does," he said. And there was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth, and somehow that made it easier to breathe. Because I did not have to pretend it was simple. I did not have to act like I was not overwhelmed. I could just exist in the reality of it. And for a second I looked out toward the city again, the lights stretching endlessly below, people moving, living lives that had nothing to do with mine. and I wondered how many of them were standing at the edge of something they did not plan, something that forced them to become someone new without asking permission. And I let out a slow breath, turning back to him. I had plans, I said, not bitter, not accusing, just stating something. That had been true before all of this. I was going to finish school, get my license, maybe move somewhere quieter, and as I spoke, I realized how distant those plans felt now, not gone, but shifted, like they belonged to a version of me that still existed but was no longer leading. And he listened without interrupting, without redirecting, his attention steady in a way that made it easier to keep going. I did not plan for this, I added, my hand pressing slightly more firmly against my stomach, not in rejection, just an acknowledgement of how unexpected it all was. And when I looked at him again, I expected some version of reassurance, something that would try to smooth the edges of what I was saying. But instead he held my gaze and said, "Then we adjust the plan." And it was so simple, so direct, that for a second I just stared at him, processing the difference between that and everything I had expected, because he did not dismiss my plans, he did not replace them, he did not tell me they no longer mattered. He just included them in something bigger, something that could change without breaking, and I felt something inside me shift again, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to loosen the tight grip I had on what I thought my life had to look like, and I leaned back slightly, studying him with a different kind of focus now, not just trying to understand what he was doing, but how he was doing it, how he made something complicated feel structured without taking away its weight. And I realized then that this was not about control in the way I had assumed. It was about stability, about creating a framework where things could exist without falling apart. And that realization settled deeper than I expected, because it meant I was not being pulled into chaos. I was being anchored into something that could hold. And the thought was both terrifying and grounding at the same time. And after a moment, I let out a quiet breath, my shoulders relaxing just slightly. And if I do not want everything to change? I asked, not as a challenge, but as a truth I needed to voice, because part of me was still holding on to that version of my life, still wondering if I could keep pieces of it intact. And his expression did not shift into something rigid, did not close off or push back. It stayed open, attentive. And he answered without hesitation, "Then we change only what is necessary." And that was when I felt it, not just the weight of the situation, but the possibility within it, the idea that this did not have to erase me to exist, that I could still be who I was becoming while stepping into something I never planned. And as the silence settled between us again, it no longer felt uncertain, it felt like space, like room to breathe, to think, to become. And for the first time since the doctor's office, since the restaurant, since everything began to unravel, I did not feel like I was losing control. I felt like I was learning how to hold it differently. The room felt quieter than before, not because the world outside had slowed down, but because something inside me finally had, like the constant noise of uncertainty had softened into something I could actually hear through. And I sat there with my hand resting against my stomach, not hiding it, not questioning it, just acknowledging it as part of me in a way I had been resisting until now. And for a moment I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to feel it fully, the weight of everything that had changed, the path I had not chosen but was now standing on. And when I opened them again, he was still there, exactly where he had been, not moving, not interrupting, just present in a way that did not demand anything but offered everything. And I realized then that this was the difference. This was why everything felt so different from what I had known before, because he was not trying to control the moment. He was holding space for it, for me, for what this was becoming. And I shifted slightly in the chair, turning more toward him, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to, because I was no longer trying to create distance between us. And that alone felt like a decision, a quiet one, but real. "If this is going to work," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "it cannot just be about what you decide." And I watched him as I spoke, not looking for resistance, but for understanding, because I needed to know that I was not stepping into something where my voice would disappear. And his gaze held mine, without wavering, steady, attentive, and he nodded once, not immediately, not dismissively, but after a second that felt intentional, like he was giving the statement the weight it deserved. "It will not be," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, No condition attached, just a simple acknowledgement that shifted something deeper than I expected, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders relaxing slightly, because that was what I needed to hear, not promises about the future, not reassurances about things no one could control, just that I would not disappear in the process of all of this. And the silence that followed felt different again, not uncertain, not heavy, just settled, like the foundation of something had finally been placed. And I looked down at my hand, at the small, barely visible change that had already altered everything. And I thought about the girl I had been earlier that night, standing in a crowded room, trying to make herself smaller, under someone else's words, trying to defend a version of herself that no longer existed. And I realized how far that felt now, how distant, not because time had passed, but because something inside me had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And I lifted my gaze back to him, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that had not been there before, not forced, not practiced, just present. "I am not the same person I was this morning," I said quietly, and it was not a question, not a doubt, just a recognition of what had already happened, and his expression did not change dramatically, but there was something in his eyes, a subtle acknowledgement, like he understood that kind of shift better than most, and he inclined his head slightly. "No," he said, "you are not." And there was no judgment in it, no expectation, just agreement, and that made it easier to accept, easier to stand in. And I let my hand rest more firmly against my stomach, not as a protective gesture, but as a connection, something grounding, something real. And I realized then that I was no longer thinking about what I had lost, not in the way I had been before. I was thinking about what this could become, what I could become within it, and that thought did not feel overwhelming anymore. It felt possible. And as I sat there, in a place I had never imagined I would be, with a future I had never planned for, I understood something that I had never fully grasped until now. That control was not about holding everything exactly the way it was. It was about knowing when to step into something new without losing yourself in the process. And for the first time since everything began, I did not feel like I was being pulled into someone else's world. I felt like I was stepping into my own, just different than I had expected.